October 25th, 1944. 6:37 a.m. Philippine Sea, off Samar. The sun is just starting to lift itself above the horizon, and the water looks deceptively calm, bruised purple, streaked with silver, broken by long, rolling swells. Over the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, the air smells like aviation fuel and salt, and the flight deck crews move with the tired efficiency of men who've been doing this for days. Engines cough. Propellers blur. A wildcat taxiing forward throws a hot wind across the deck that tastes like exhaust. Then the first report hits the radio like a punch. Many ships bearing north. At first it's just noise, another contact, another blip. The Philippines have been a storm of blips and threats. But on the bridge, the officer of the deck feels something change in the cadence of the voice. It's not excitement. It's disbelief. A moment later, a lookout shout carries across the wind. Mast on the horizon. And suddenly, you can see them. Thin vertical lines at first, ghosts. Then the lines thicken into silhouettes. Towers. Pagoda masts. Heavy shapes moving with purpose. Cutting the sea with the confidence of ships that don't expect to be challenged. Someone raises binoculars and swears under his breath. Because what's coming out of the morning haze isn't a destroyer screen. It's a fleet, a battleship fleet. Off to the east, rain squalls drag curtains across the ocean, and for a second the Japanese ships vanish behind the gray. Then reappear closer, sharper, like the weather itself is revealing them in stages to maximize the horror. On the carriers of Task Unit April 3rd, 77, Taffy 3, men begin to realize the impossible truth. They're the smallest kind of carrier group, built for close support and convoy work, now staring at the kind of surface force meant to smash fleets. Taffy 3 is not supposed to be here for this. Taffy 3 is 6 small escort carriers, jeep carriers, with thin skins and flight decks full of aircraft armed for ground support. They have a handful of escorts, destroyers and destroyer escorts, good ships, brave ships, but not battleships. Not heavy cruisers. Not the steel mountains now, sliding toward them like a closing door. On USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague stands on the bridge and watches the horizon with the kind of stillness that comes when your mind is moving too fast for your body to keep up. He knows his job in the next few minutes will decide whether thousands of men live or disappear into the sea. A voice on the bridge, tight, clipped, calls out identification as if naming the enemy can reduce the danger. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. And then the ocean flashes. The first Japanese salvo lands short, tall white geysers punching up beside the carriers. For a second, the spray hangs in the air like shattered glass. And the next salvos walk closer. The sound arrives a moment later, distant, heavy, like a giant slamming doors somewhere out in the world. You can almost feel it in your chest, the pressure of big guns firing from beyond the horizon of your comfort. On the escort carriers, alarm bells begin to scream. Flight deck crews scatter. Planes that were about to launch are shoved, yanked, repositioned. Anything to get them airborne before the deck becomes a burning, splintering trap. Pilots sprint, helmets under arms, climbing into cockpits with hands that don't have time to shake. Get them off the deck. Launch everything. On the destroyers, the response is instantaneous and violent. Because the destroyers understand something the carriers don't have the luxury to learn slowly. If those big guns get a clean line of fire, the carriers will die fast. On the bridge of USS Johnston, Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans watches the same horizon. And instead of freezing, he leans forward like a man who's just made a decision before anyone else has finished realizing there's a choice to make. Johnston is a Fletcher-class destroyer, fast, sharp, built for knife fighting in the dark. Her crew can feel the deck vibrating under their feet as the engines respond. The ship smells like hot oil, paint, and the faint metallic tang of fear. On the voice circuits, reports flood in. Enemy battleships bearing 330. Enemy heavy cruisers closing. Sprague's order cuts through the confusion from the flagship. Make smoke. Hide the carriers. Blind the enemy. Run south. Run east. run anywhere that isn't directly under those guns. And as the carriers begin to turn away, laying down thick gray smoke that crawls across the sea like a living thing, Evans sees what the smoke really is. Not concealment, a curtain, a chance, because smoke is only useful if someone stands in front of it and takes the hits. Evans looks at the enemy force, massive, advancing, confident, and then he looks back at the thin, vulnerable shapes of the escort carriers behind him. They're launching planes as fast as they can. They're turning away, trying to build distance. Men on those decks are doing miracles with fuel hoses and bomb carts and shouted orders. But miracles need time, and time is exactly what the Japanese fleet is about to steal. On Johnston, Evans' voice comes down the bridge, calm enough to be terrifying. All engines ahead flank. The deck shudders as the ship surges forward, the bow cutting hard into the swells. Men grab rails. Guns begin to traverse, searching for targets through haze and smoke. A junior officer hesitates, just long enough to let the reality catch up. "Sir, we're going in." Evans doesn't turn. He keeps his eyes on the horizon where the enemy guns are already finding their range. He answers like a man stating the weather. "We're going in." Because if the carriers can't outrun a battleship's shells, then someone has to charge them. And as Johnston accelerates into the smoke, alone at first, a small gray blade sprinting toward a wall of steel, the Japanese salvos begin to fall closer, and the ocean around her starts erupting like boiling water. The distance is shrinking fast, too fast, and the next few minutes will decide whether this little destroyer becomes a shield or a name spoken with disbelief for the rest of the war. The smoke begins to pour out in thick, oily curtains, white-gray at first, then darker as the destroyers lay it down in desperate streaks. It crawls across the sea, swallowing the escort carriers one by one, turning them into vague shapes that might, if you're lucky, become harder to hit. But smoke only works if someone buys the time. On the bridge of USS Johnston, DD 557, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans watches the carriers start to disappear behind that man-made fog, and he does something that feels almost insane. He turns toward the enemy. At 6:57, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague orders Taffy 3 to run east at top speed and make smoke. The carriers heel into their turns, flight decks tilting just enough that the parked planes seem to lean with them, like they're bracing for impact. The radio is a snarl of clipped reports and rising panic. Then Johnston swings out of formation, hard to port, her bow slicing into the swells. Men on deck feel the ship accelerate into a different kind of world. The protective umbrella of the group is behind them now. Ahead is a wall of steel, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, battleships and cruisers advancing with big gun certainty. Evans doesn't hesitate. He's not calculating survival. He's calculating delay. Because if the Japanese get clean line of sight to the carriers, it's over. On the forward gun mounts, crews snap into action. Helmets, flak jackets, hands already moving by muscle memory. The 5-inch/38 barrels elevate. Breech blocks clack. Powder smells sharp and chemical. The director tries to solve a firing problem that shouldn't exist. A destroyer taking aim at cruisers and battleships, targets that can kill you from beyond your own reach. And then the Japanese notice him. At first, it's bracketing splashes, near misses that throw columns of water as tall as masts. Each splash lands with a concussion you feel through your boots. The sea is suddenly violent in an unnatural way, punched and torn by shell impacts. Evans drives Johnston through it anyway, flank speed, bow rising and falling like a runner's shoulders. You can almost see what the Japanese gunners see through their optics. A fast, gray shape cutting out of smoke, charging directly into their formation like it belongs there. Like it's a cruiser. Like it's not afraid. That mistake matters. It buys seconds. And seconds, out here, are life. As the range closes, Johnston opens fire. Her guns start hammering. Deep, rhythmic booms that travel through the ship's frame. Hot shell, casings clatter. Orders snap. Commence firing. Rapid fire. Gunnery Officer Lieutenant Robert Hagen focuses the ship's fire on a leading heavy cruiser, Kumano, and Johnston's shells begin to land. You can picture it. Bright orange flashes on the cruiser's superstructure, small fires blooming where metal and paint and fuel meet impact. The enemy is huge, but not invulnerable. The distance collapses for miles to something personal. Evans is doing two things at once: firing and maneuvering, weaving and turning, laying smoke and dodging salvos. It's not a clean duel. It's a brawl at full speed, a destroyer dancing between geysers of water while heavy guns try to crush it. Then Evans commits to the knife. He orders the torpedo run. The words travel down the ship like electricity. Men at the torpedo mounts swing and set. Mark 15 torpedoes, long, steel cylinders carrying a brutal promise, are made ready. The sea wind whips across the deck, and the mounts feel suddenly very exposed. There's no armor here, no protection except speed and nerve. Johnston closes to roughly 10,000 yards, dangerously close enough that the Japanese cruiser's secondary guns can start to chew you apart. Evans turns to bring the broadside torpedoes to bear. And then, one by one, the torpedoes drop. 10 white streaks in the water, racing away with hidden engines, fanning out toward the oncoming cruiser line. For a second, there's an eerie pause, the way the ocean always pauses before it decides whether it will keep you alive. Then a torpedo hits. On Kumano, the impact is catastrophic. Her bow is blown apart, torn away as if a giant fist ripped it off. The sight is unreal. A warship's front ends simply, missing, water boiling where steel used to be. The Japanese formation stutters. A major cruiser is forced out of line. Another cruiser slows to cover her. The neat geometry of Kurita's advance starts to fracture. And Johnston, this small destroyer that should have been annihilated, turns back into the smoke alive. Not safe, but alive. She vanishes behind her own smoke screen, and for a heartbeat you might think, that's it. A perfect strike. A hit and run that bought the carriers the breath they needed. But the Japanese aren't done. The big ships are still coming, and now they're angry. Through gaps in smoke and rain squalls, the silhouette of a battleship looms, so large it seems to carry its own horizon. Somewhere out there is Yamato, the heaviest battleship afloat, and she's looking for targets. Johnston turns again, reappearing out of the haze, because Evans is not finished. He swings back toward the carrier's wake, laying more smoke, firing again, trying to keep enemy eyes off the flight decks where American pilots are launching with whatever they can carry: depth charges, machine gun ammo, half-full fuel tanks, anything that can hurt a warship or at least make it flinch. The sea becomes a maze of smoke, rain, muzzle flashes, and sudden violence. And in that maze, the Japanese finally find the destroyer's range. The next salvos come in tighter. The splashes stop being near. They start feeling like a countdown. A shell lands close enough to spray Johnston's decks with dyed water, red-tinted foam sliding across gray paint. Another burst is so near it lifts the ship with raw force. Men stumble. Someone grabs a rail and feels it vibrating like a living thing. Evan stays on the bridge, eyes forward. He has just driven a destroyer into gun range of a battleship fleet and lived. But living is not the same as surviving, because now, as Johnston breaks out of the smoke again, still firing, still screening, still refusing to leave her carriers alone, there's a new sound cutting through the battle. Not the crack of cruiser guns, not the chatter of automatic fire. A deeper, slower concussion, like the ocean itself being struck, the kind of sound that only comes from the heaviest guns afloat. And the next time Johnston emerges into daylight, it will be straight into the path of a salvo meant to erase her. Smoke and rain squalls wrap the ocean in shifting walls, gray on gray, so the battle keeps appearing and disappearing like a nightmare you can't hold in your hands. For a few breathless minutes, USS Johnston lives inside that fog. Engines screaming, decks slick with salt spray, gun crews still firing whenever a silhouette gives them permission. Then the smoke thins, and the world snaps into focus. Off the starboard bow, a Japanese battle line looms through the haze. Massive hulls with towering pagoda masts, cruiser columns cutting clean wakes, destroyers knifing along the edges. It's not just enemy ships. It's the weight of them, a moving fortress. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurida's center force, built to smash anything unlucky enough to meet it at sea. On Johnston's bridge, Ernest E. Evans watches that wall of steel and does not retreat into the logic of survival. He retreats into the logic of duty. Behind him, the escort carriers are running. 6 small CVs turning away at their best speed, flight decks busy with frantic launches. These aren't fleet carriers built to duel. They're compact workhorses meant to support troops ashore, suddenly sprinting for their lives with battleship shells starting to walk toward them. Evans knows what happens if the Japanese get a clean look. So Johnston keeps showing herself. A destroyer doesn't hold a line against battleships the way a movie might pretend. It holds a line by stealing attention, by being loud, fast, and painful enough that the enemy has to look at you instead of the fragile ships behind you. And the enemy finally does. The first heavy-caliber salvos don't sound like gunfire. They sound like doors being slammed by a giant, slow, deep concussions that make the air feel thicker. Water erupts around the destroyer in towering white columns. Men on deck flinch as spray crashes over them. Salt water stinging faces and eyes, the ship shuddering with each near miss. A splintering impact hits somewhere forward, then another. And suddenly, Johnston is no longer dancing between splashes. She's being hit. Japanese shells, large enough that the mind refuses to picture them, tear into the destroyer's superstructure. Steel buckles. Compartments flash with smoke and hot dust. A fire control director goes silent. Voice circuits crackle and die in places. Men are thrown against bulkheads, ears ringing, mouths full of that metallic taste that comes right after shock. On the bridge, the blast is close enough to feel like a hand grabbing your skull. Evans is wounded, blood, shrapnel, torn cloth, and still he stays upright. Still he commands, refusing to leave the fight just because the fight has finally found him. Below, in engineering spaces, the damage is immediate and cruel. Speed drops. The ship that had been a sprinting blade is suddenly limping, the deck vibration changing pitch as power falters. For a few terrifying minutes, it feels like the destroyer is about to die right there in open water, visible, damaged, and surrounded by ships that could finish her from a distance. But Johnston doesn't sink. Not yet. Damage control parties move like men possessed. Hands on hoses, axes, patching lines, dragging wounded out of smoke. They don't have time for fear because fear doesn't stop flooding. Someone yells for stretchers. Someone else yells that the forward guns are back partly. Manually. Not elegant, but alive. And while Johnston fights to keep breathing, she isn't alone anymore. Out of the smoke, another American destroyer charges. USS Hull. Thin gray hull cutting hard toward the Japanese line. Almost immediately, she's bracketed by shell fire, so heavy the ocean around her seems to boil. Then USS Heermann throws herself into the same impossible geometry, closing range, making torpedo threats that force Japanese ships to maneuver. And then, almost unbelievably, a destroyer escort joins the charge. USS Samuel B. Roberts was never meant for this. A DE is supposed to guard convoys, hunt submarines, protect bigger ships, not trade blows with heavy cruisers. Yet she surges forward anyway, firing her 5-inch gun like she's trying to convince the enemy that size is a suggestion, not a law. Later people will call her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. And in these minutes you understand why. Above all of it, American aircraft begin to throw themselves into the fight. Not in neat, planned strike packages, but in desperate waves launched off fleeing decks. Pilots climb with whatever they had time to load, machine gun ammo, rockets, even ordnance meant for ground targets. Some Avengers go in with weapons that aren't ideal for ships, but today ideal is a luxury nobody has. The goal is to harass, confuse, force turns, and by seconds the way the destroyers by seconds, by making the enemy react. The Japanese, seeing carriers and believing, at least for a time, that they've stumbled onto something larger, begin firing with the urgency of men who think they're about to win the war, in the morning. And the carriers pay for it. Through a gap in smoke, a battleship salvo lands near an escort carrier, water columns rising like skyscrapers. Another salvo walks in. The carrier's wake staggers. Men on deck stare at the sea exploding beside them, knowing one direct hit can turn the flight deck into a coffin. Somewhere in that chaos, USS Gamber Bay, already under pressure, already slower, starts taking the kind of attention a small carrier can't endure for long. On Johnston, Evans watches it happen through broken sight lines and smoke. The carriers are running. The escorts are bleeding. The enemy is still closing. And the question hanging over the ocean now isn't can they win. It's simpler, sharper. Can they keep the carriers alive long enough for help to arrive? Because in the far distance, beyond the smoke, beyond the fear, somewhere out there is the rest of the American fleet. And unless that help appears soon, Taffy 3 is going to be crushed under the weight of a battleship fleet that has finally found its prey. The escort carriers run south and east, pushing their little engines as hard as they can, 19 knots on a good day, and the sea behind them fills with smoke like a drag curtain. But smoke doesn't stop steel. It only hides it. On USS Fanshawe Bay, Sprague's flagship, the bridge windows rattle as another distant salvo lands close enough to make the ocean jump. The spray comes down in sheets, and for a heartbeat the world outside is nothing but white water and gray smoke. When it clears, the silhouettes are closer. Too close. A voice cuts across the flight deck. Launch everything. Not a neat strike package. Not a measured response. Everything. Wildcats and Avengers that were meant to hit shore targets, loaded wrong, fueled wrong, armed wrong, are now the only air cover between 6 small carriers and a Japanese surface force that was built to erase fleets. You can almost feel the flight deck under your boots, hot metal, vibrating with engines, slick with spray. Deck crews sprint with chocks and tie-downs, hands moving faster than thought. A bomb cart clatters. A fuel hose is yanked away at the last possible second. A pilot slams his canopy shut and gives a thumbs up that looks steady until you notice his arm trembling. The first plane goes over the bow and drops, then catches air and climbs barely. Then another. Behind them, the carrier's wakes twist as they dodge shell splashes. Every turn throws the deck just enough to make launching feel like jumping off a moving roof in a storm. Out beyond the smoke, Japanese gunners are solving the problem. They've found the range. Salvos begin to walk, left, right, closer, until a shell lands with a cracking roar that's no longer near, but personal. On the carriers, men go flat when the big splashes rise, because instinct understands what the mind refuses to accept. A direct hit from an 8-inch cruiser gun can tear through a jeep carrier like a fist through paper. Sprague watches the smoke and knows he's gambling with seconds. If he can keep the carriers hidden, keep the enemy turning, keep them guessing what they're facing, there's a chance. The Japanese reports will later misidentify these little escort carriers as much larger ships, an error that matters, because it bends enemy decisions in the fog of war. And then the smoke parts, just a little. Just enough. A Japanese heavy cruiser appears in a gap, like a predator slipping through tall grass, its guns flashing bright orange. The flash is followed by the slow, crushing whump of impact somewhere nearby, and suddenly men on the flight deck can hear shrapnel pinging against metal like thrown gravel. Down low, close to the waterline, destroyers and destroyer escorts keep charging, laying smoke, firing, turning, firing again, trying to drag Japanese attention away from the flight decks. The ocean is now stitched with white tracks, shells, wakes, spray, and the thin, desperate lines of torpedoes cutting invisible paths. Above them, the pilots are doing something that should not work. They dive anyway. An Avenger drops toward a cruiser with a low doubt meant for land. Maybe rockets, maybe small bombs, maybe even depth charges and releases, not because it's perfect, but because it's something. Wildcat strafe, their .50 calories flashing, trying to rake exposed decks and gun crews, trying to force heads down, trying to buy one more minute. In the cockpit, a pilot can see the enemy's muzzle flashes, steady, methodical, while his own ship's flight deck shrinks behind him into smoke. He doesn't have the luxury to wonder if his ordnance will do real damage. He only has to make the Japanese turn, make them hesitate, make them look up, because the moment the Japanese stop reacting, the carriers die, and one of them begins to fall behind. USS Gambier Bay, CV-73, is a Casablanca-class escort carrier, compact, hard-working, never meant to be the center of a surface gunfight. Her captain, Walter V.R. Vuwag, watches the battle compress around his ship as shell splashes get tighter and tighter. She's taking near misses that feel like hammer blows. Each impact lifts water and shakes the hull. Inside, in engine spaces, men fight the ship itself, steam lines, valves flooding, while above them the flight deck tries to keep launching planes through chaos. Then a shell hits in a way that changes everything. At 8:43, Gambier Bay takes a hit that destroys her forward engine room, and the ship's heartbeat stutters, then slows, then stops, dead in the water. A carrier that can't move is not a ship anymore. It's a target. The moment her speed drops, the geometry of the battle shifts. Her sisters, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Cullinan Bay, Kitcun Bay, St. Lo, continue to run through smoke and rain squalls, dodging, twisting, surviving by motion. But Gambier Bay begins to lag, her wake thinning, her bow no longer cutting away from danger. And the Japanese notice. A battleship's silhouette turns slightly, slow, confident, like a giant changing its gaze. Heavy cruisers begin to angle in. You can almost see it from above, sharks curving toward a wounded animal. On Gambier Bay's deck, men look aft and see the other carriers fading into smoke. They are not abandoning her. They can't stop, because if they stop, they all die together. So Gambier Bay becomes the one ship still visible, still slow, still exposed. Japanese shells start to fall around her in a tighter pattern, and the sound changes. Less distant thunder, more immediate tearing. Metal shrieks. Smoke rises from fresh holes. The flight deck crew keeps moving until there's nowhere safe to move to. Some of her aircraft are already airborne, circling back into the fight with whatever fuel remains, because there's nowhere else to go. Others will never leave the deck. Sprague hears the reports come in broken, clipped transmissions that carry the weight of helplessness. Gambier Bay hit losing speed. He grips the rail on the bridge and forces his mind into action. He can't save her by stopping. He can only save the rest by keeping the enemy confused and pulled apart. So the call goes out again, sharper now, almost desperate. Small boys attack. And out in the smoke, battered and bleeding, USS Johnston turns back toward the guns one more time. Because if the Japanese cruisers reach Gambier Bay at point-blank range, the battle ends in minutes. As Johnston limps into clearer water, her remaining gun crews swing their barrels toward the approaching shapes. And on the horizon, a new line of Japanese ships begins to form up for a finishing move. Not gunfire this time, a torpedo run. The ocean doesn't warn you before a torpedo run. It just changes its posture. In the smoke-shredded gaps between squalls, lookouts start yelling. Sharp, urgent, because they've seen something unnatural on the water. Thin white wakes cutting fast, too straight, too deliberate. Torpedoes in the water. A torpedo isn't a shell you can dodge with luck. It's a decision already made, sliding toward you under the surface with patient violence. On the escort carriers, the helmsmen crank hard over, rudders biting, trying to throw those small, fragile ships into wild zigzags. Flight decks tilt. Men grab whatever they can. Planes chained down rattle against their lashings. On the destroyers, it becomes something else entirely. A destroyer can't out-armor a battleship. It can't outgun a cruiser. But it can do one thing that forces even giants to flinch. It can threaten torpedoes. That threat is a leash. And right now, Taffy 3 needs every leash it can get. Through a thinning curtain of smoke, USS Johnston reappears. No longer the sleek knife that charged at dawn, but a battered, limping fighter still refusing to leave the ring. Her superstructure is scarred. Antennas are twisted. Fires have been beaten down in places and are still burning in others. She's taken hits that should have ended her. Yet there she is, still moving, still firing. On the bridge, Ernest Evans is wounded and upright, the kind of upright that isn't posture anymore. It's stubbornness made physical. The ship's speed isn't what it was. Systems are damaged. The fight now is half gunnery, half survival. But Evans turns her anyway, back toward the enemy. Because out there, heavy cruisers are closing on the wounded USS Gamber Bay like wolves circling a limping animal. And Johnston understands something simple and brutal. If the cruisers get close enough to use rapid-fire guns at short range, the carrier will be torn apart. So Johnston opens up again. Her remaining 5-inch guns hammer at anything that looks like a cruiser's bridge, rangefinder, gun mount, anything that might blind the giant long enough for it to stumble. The shells land like angry sparks on a steel wall. The enemy returns fire with contemptuous power, and the water around the destroyer erupts in violent columns, bracketing her like a countdown. Nearby, USS Harriman is also moving like a madman, darting, turning, making torpedo feints that force Japanese ships to swing away at the worst possible time. A torpedo threat doesn't have to hit to be devastating. It just has to make a cruiser turn, break formation, lose firing solutions, and waste precious minutes repositioning. And then there's the ship that seems almost too small to matter, charging anyway. USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort. The kind of ship you build to protect convoys and hunt submarines. She has no business being here. No armor, no heavy punch, no aura of power. But she goes in. Her crew loads and fires with furious rhythm. And the little ship hurls herself toward a Japanese cruiser like she's trying to convince the ocean that courage can bend physics. Men later say she fought like a battleship. And in this moment, you can see why. Because she refuses to act like what she is. The Japanese cruiser Chikuma, big, fast, heavily armed, becomes one of her targets, and Roberts keeps firing until her barrels are hot, until her decks are slick, until the air around her smells like burned powder and salt and fear. Shells begin to find her. Not one, many. A cruiser's guns don't hit a small ship the way a fist hits a man. They hit the way a wrecking ball hits a shed. Steel rips. Compartments flood. Men are thrown. Fires bloom. And still she keeps firing. Around them, USS Hull is also paying the ultimate price, charging so close under heavy fire that the sea seems to rise up and slap her back down. You catch glimpses through smoke, her bow lifting, her gun still working, then sudden impacts and smoke and the sickening sense that she's being overwhelmed by a force too large to fight for long. This is what small boys attack actually means. Not a slogan, a sacrifice. A handful of thin-hulled ships throwing themselves between aircraft carriers and battleships, turning the ocean into a maze of smoke and torpedo wakes, forcing the enemy to react, to turn, to hesitate. Above, the air battle becomes a swarm of desperation. American pilots keep coming, some with bombs, some with rockets, some with nothing but machine guns and rage. They dive on cruisers and battleships to keep them turning, keep them distracted, keep them looking up instead of forward. In the cockpit, you can see the enemy ships firing, anti-aircraft bursts blooming like black flowers, while the sea below churns with shell splashes and smoke. And then it happens. A moment so cruelly clean, it feels scripted. USS Gamber Bay, slow and exposed, takes more hits. Her list increases. Her flight deck becomes a mess of smoke and debris. The wounded ship tries to keep moving, tries to keep breathing, but the cruisers have finally closed the distance. The carrier's wake stutters. Men look at the waterline and see it rising up the hull where it shouldn't. When she finally begins to go down, it isn't dramatic like a movie. It's heavy, slow, unavoidable. A ship settling into the sea while the battle rages elsewhere, as if the ocean has decided to claim its dead. For a second, you might think this is where hope breaks. But something strange is happening to the Japanese, too. Their formation is messy now. Ships turning to avoid torpedoes, cruisers out of position, smoke confusing identification, aircraft harassing from above. Reports are conflicting. The American carriers, small as they are, have been mistaken for something larger in the chaos. And most importantly, Kurita doesn't have a clear picture anymore. He expected to punch through and find the invasion fleet. Instead, he's fighting a hornet's nest that won't stop stinging. A battleship's guns fire again, deep, slow concussions. And then, through the haze, you notice something incredible. Some Japanese ships are turning away. Not running. Never that, but shifting, disengaging, trying to regroup. The pressure on the carriers eases slightly, like a fist loosening just enough for you to breathe. On the decks of the surviving escort carriers, men look at one another as if they don't trust what they're feeling. Is it happening? Are they surviving? And right when the question forms, right when the ocean seems to give them a thin sliver of mercy, a new warning screams across the radios. Not from the horizon, from the sky. Incoming aircraft low fast. Men tilt their heads up, and out of the brightening morning, a single plane drops toward them with a straight, unwavering intent that has nothing to do with bombs, and everything to do with impact. The warning comes too late to feel like a warning. Incoming aircraft low fast. Men on the flight deck snap their heads upward, squinting into the brightening morning. For a heartbeat, you can't see anything, just sun glare and thin cloud and the smeared edges of smoke. Then the shape appears, dropping out of the light like a thrown knife. A single Japanese aircraft coming in low, nose down, steady. Not weaving, not searching, committed. On the escort carrier USS St. Lo, the sound of general quarters is already background noise. Bells, shouted orders, the rattle of boots. Everyone is running on adrenaline and instinct. Anti-aircraft guns are manned. Tracers stitch upward in frantic streams. The air fills with the harsh, metallic chatter of 20 millimeters and 40 millimeters mounts firing so fast the barrels look like they're shaking themselves apart. And still the plane keeps coming. You can almost feel the sickening clarity of it. This isn't a bomb run. This isn't a pilot trying to survive. This is a pilot trying to hit. The aircraft slices through flak and tracer fire, wings trembling, smoke trailing from a hit that should have made him break off. But he doesn't break. He steadies, like a man forcing his hands not to shake, and aims for the flight deck itself. In those last seconds, the entire carrier becomes a single, helpless idea. Too big to dodge, too slow to turn away. The gunners keep firing. Tracers smack into the plane. Pieces flick off it. Flames lick from the engine cowling. It doesn't matter. The plane impacts the flight deck with a violence that feels like the ship has been struck by a hammer the size of a building. Metal buckles. Debris explodes outward. The crash doesn't sound like wood and steel. It sounds like the sky breaking. For a moment, there's a stunned pause, like the ship's body is trying to understand what just entered it. Then the fire blooms. Not a small fire. Not a manageable blaze. A hungry, roaring fire fed by aviation fuel, smashed aircraft parts, and the exposed underside of a flight deck that was never meant to be punched open like this. Smoke pours upward in thick black columns. Men cough and stumble backward, faces lit orange by flame. And below the deck, down in the carrier's guts, something worse is happening. Because escort carriers are full of volatile things. Gasoline, bombs, rockets, ammunition. The kind of cargo you carry when your job is to launch aircraft. Now the ship has fire at the center of that cargo. Damage control parties rush in with hoses, axes, extinguishers. They move with the desperate speed of men who know the difference between contained and catastrophe is measured in seconds. Orders are screamed over the roar. Water sprays into flame and turns into steam, scalding faces and hands. Somewhere, someone yells that the fire is spreading towards stored ordnance. Someone else yells that the elevators are jammed. Someone else yells for stretchers. You can almost taste the smoke, thick and oily, stinging your throat as if the air has become poisonous. And out beyond the burning deck, the surface battle is still unfolding. The Japanese ships that have been closing now seem less certain. Their formation is scattered. The smoke has lied to them. Torpedo wakes have forced them into turns they didn't want to make. Aircraft harassment has kept them looking up when they needed to be looking forward. For a while, it felt like the ocean itself was bending to give Taffy 3 a chance. Then the kamikaze reminds everyone the battle isn't a single line. It's a trap with multiple jaws. On St. Lo, the flames intensify. Heat rolls across the deck in waves. Men are forced back, choking, eyes streaming. The ship's loudspeaker calls out damage control orders that start to sound thin against the roar of the fire. Below, there's a sudden deep thud, muffled, heavy. Then another, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to burning fuel. The kind of sound that suggests something exploding in an enclosed space. A crewman turns toward a hatch and feels hot air breathe out like a living thing. Then the carrier convulses. A violent internal explosion rips through the ship, strong enough to lift bodies and slam them back down, strong enough to turn metal into shrapnel inside passageways. The blast is followed by a new roar, louder and deeper, as if the ship has become a furnace. In the smoke, men run without seeing where they're going. A sailor grabs another by the collar and drags him away from a hatch just as flame blasts through it. Someone trips over debris and scrambles up with hands bleeding, not even noticing. For a few seconds, it becomes impossible to tell what's happening first. The fire? The ammunition? The ship's own structure giving way? The list begins, subtle at first, the kind of tilt you feel in your knees before you see it with your eyes. Water is coming in somewhere, and the ship is starting to lose the argument. Abandoned ship is the phrase nobody wants to say too early, but waiting too long kills people. On deck, the command to abandon ship begins to spread like a whisper, turning into a shout. Men cut loose life rafts, throw floats, climb down nets with hands that slip on oil and sweat. Some jump straight into the water because the deck is too hot to stand on. The sea below is crowded with wreckage and fuel slicks. It's cold. It's indifferent. It doesn't care if you were a pilot or a cook or an admiral. It just takes. The carrier's bow dips slightly. Smoke continues to pour from the shattered deck. Men in the water look up and see the ship towering above them. Still alive, still burning, still fighting to stay afloat. And then another internal detonation hits, and the ship's fate becomes obvious in the way a man's fate becomes obvious when his knees buckle and he can't stand again. St. Lo begins to sink. Not instantly, not with a dramatic snap, with the slow inevitability of something too wounded to carry itself any longer. Around her, other carriers and escorts are still moving, still firing, still trying to survive a battle that refuses to end cleanly. They can't stop to save everyone, not in the middle of an air attack zone. So men in the water cling to debris, watch the smoke, and pray the next aircraft chooses another target. And as St. Lo settles lower, the horizon does something strange. The Japanese surface force, those battleships and heavy cruisers that should have crushed this little group, begins to withdraw. Not because they've been destroyed, not because they've been beaten ship for ship, but because the battle has become chaotic, costly, and confusing, because the easy prey fought back like a hornet swarm, and because Kurita can't see the clear road to his real objective anymore. For the Americans, it feels unreal. They've lost ships. They've lost men. They've watched a carrier burn and sink. Yet the giant fist that was closing around them is loosening. And in that loosening is a new fear. What if the Japanese turn back? What if this is a feint? What if the next wave of aircraft is already lining up in the sun? Men on rafts look skyward, blinking through smoke, waiting for the next screaming dive. Because even as the battleships fade into haze, the sky is still hunting. For a few minutes after St. Lo is hit, the battle feels like two wars layered on top of each other. One war is on the horizon. Battleships and heavy cruisers half hidden by smoke, still throwing occasional salvos as if they can't quite accept they're letting their prey slip away. The other war is right here. Fire, floating debris, men in the water, and the sickening smell of aviation gasoline spreading in a thin rainbow sheen across the sea. If you're in the water, everything sounds different. Gunfire becomes distant thunder. Engines become a vibration in your bones. You tread and tread and tread, swallowing salt. Try not to panic when you feel something brush your leg. Rope, debris, maybe nothing at all. You look up and the escort carriers are moving, still moving, because stopping means dying. Over on Fanshawe Bay, Sprague's bridge team watches the Japanese silhouettes fade in and out. The smoke is still doing its job, but only barely. A squall drifts between fleets, and for a moment the ocean looks like it's trying to hide what it's just witnessed. Then a report comes and that changes the temperature on the bridge. Enemy ships turning. At first, nobody believes it. Not because it's impossible for a fleet to turn, because it's impossible for this fleet to turn away from these carriers. But as seconds pass, the lookouts keep confirming it. The shapes are shifting north and west. The gun flashes grow less frequent. The pressure, so relentless at dawn, loosens like fingers uncurled from a throat. Out there, Kurita is trying to piece together a battle that makes no sense. He came hunting the invasion fleet, big transports, vulnerable ships, a decisive target. Instead, he ran into smoke, torpedoes, relentless air attacks, and destroyers charging like they were trying to start a knife fight with a mountain. His ships have taken damage. Heavy cruisers have been torpedoed, bombed, set afire. His formation is scattered. Reports are contradictory. And in that chaos, the escort carriers, small as they are, have been misread as something larger, something more dangerous. The truth is cruelly simple. Kurita cannot see clearly enough to take the risk. So the Japanese begin to disengage. Not a rout, not a panic, a withdrawal under pressure, turning away from the Hornets, trying to regroup, try to escape the torpedo threat and the constant harassment from the air. On the American side, it feels like waking up mid-fall and realizing, somehow, you're not going to hit the ground. But then you look around and see what it cost. Gambier Bay is gone, taken under by gunfire after fighting to run when she couldn't run fast enough. St. Lo is burning, wounded beyond saving, and men in the water watch her with the helpless horror of people watching a building collapse while friends are still inside. And the small boys are paying the bill in full. Somewhere in the haze, USS Hull is in her final fight, battered until she can no longer stay above the surface. USS Samuel B. Roberts, the little DE that charged like a destroyer, is shattered, her crew still fighting fires and flooding until the ocean finally wins. And USS Johnston, Evan's ship, has been seen again and again, the worst places, still firing, still turning, still drawing fire away from carriers that should have been dead hours ago. Now, as the Japanese turn away, the battle shifts into something quieter and more brutal. Rescue. Survival. Finding men before the sea decides their names don't matter. On the escort carriers, sailors who were loading bombs and fueling planes minutes earlier are now throwing life rings, lowering nets, leaning over rails to grab hands that are shaking too hard to hold on. A man in the water reaches for a rope and misses, fingers sliding off wet hemp. And for a second, he's sure he's done. Then another arm hooks under his armpit and yanks him up, and he coughs seawater and laughs like it hurts because laughter is the only thing that proves he's still alive. Pilots return low on fuel, landing on decks that are scarred and smoking, hooking wires with hands that feel numb from adrenaline. Some come back with holes in wings, flak tears in fuselage, oil streaking across canopies. They climb out of cockpits and don't speak at first, just stare at the ocean where destroyers fought battleships. And out beyond the carriers, still in the shattered middle distance, a lone gray shape limps through smoke. A destroyer, listing slightly, slower than she should be, still refusing to leave the fight. That's Johnston. Her crew is exhausted. Her systems are wrecked. Her bridge has been hit. Her guns are fewer now, but the ones that remain still fire when they can. She has become a symbol and a target at the same time, and the enemy sees her. Even as Kurita pulls away, not every Japanese ship is blind in the chaos. A cruiser's guns flash again. A destroyer screen shifts. The ocean around Johnston erupts with near misses, violent splashes that slap the hull and drench the deck. For the men aboard, it must feel like the battle refuses to let them go. Evan stays with his ship, wounded, bloodied, still commanding because command is the only thing holding this floating wreck together. There's a moment, brief, almost quiet, when the smoke opens just enough to show the size of what he charged at dawn. Not one ship, Not two, a whole force. And yet the carriers behind him are alive, still moving, still launching, still existing in a morning when they were supposed to vanish. The ocean, however, is not finished taking what it's owed, because the final chapter of Samar isn't written on the flight decks. It's written on a crippled destroyer still out there, still firing, while the Japanese, turning away, decide whether to finish her as a parting act, or leave her to sink alone with the sunrise. The smoke thins in ragged patches now, like torn cloth, and the ocean feels suddenly too wide, too exposed for a ship that can barely run. USS Johnston limps on, her silhouette no longer sharp and aggressive, but battered and uneven. The kind of ship you can identify from far away by what's missing: an antenna gone, a section of superstructure torn open, gun mount scarred and blackened. Her wake is shorter than it should be. Her speed is wrong, and speed is life. On board, the crew can hear it in the ship's voice, the engines straining, the vibrations uneven. Every man can sense that the destroyer is running on stubbornness and damage control, not on design. The smell is a harsh mix of burned powder, hot metal, and smoke that never fully clears your throat. But she's still in the fight, because even as the Japanese begin to withdraw, the sea doesn't grant mercy all at once. A few enemy ships still have line of sight. A few still want a final blow. And Johnston, the destroyer that charged the fleet at dawn, has become a kind of insult floating on the water. She's the proof that the prey fought back. So they aim at her again. A cruiser's guns flash, bright, clean muzzle bursts in the distance. And a second later the ocean around Johnston erupts in towering splashes. The near misses slam the hull like invisible fists. The deck shudders. Men grab rails and bulkheads to keep their feet. Somewhere forward, a gun crew keeps firing whenever a target shows itself through haze. The gun captain's voice is hoarse now, but he's still calling corrections like the world is normal. Up two. Right one. Fire. The gun recoils. The ship flinches. Hot casings clatter. A man wipes sweat and soot from his eyes with a sleeve already stiff with salt. On the bridge, or what's left of it, Ernest Evans stays with his ship. He's wounded, blood-dried in places, fresh in others, and his uniform looks like it's been dragged through a furnace. Yet his posture is the same posture he had at dawn. Forward, intent, refusing to lean back from what's coming. You can almost feel the reality pressing in on the men around him. They did it. They kept the carriers alive long enough. They forced the enemy to turn. So why does it still feel like the battle isn't done? Because ships don't get to leave a fight just because the larger story is turning in their favor. A crippled destroyer still has to survive the next salvo, the next fire, the next flooding compartment, the next minute. And now, Johnston is getting slower. One hit comes in hard, closer than before, and you hear steel tear with a sound like someone ripping a metal sheet in half. The ship's list deepens slightly. Not enough for panic, but enough that every sailor's stomach drops. Damage control parties move again, always again, dragging hoses, slamming doors, shouting over the roar. They're fighting water with their hands and fire with their bodies. They're doing math with oxygen and minutes. A compartment floods. Someone yells to seal it. A door slams. A man on the wrong side of it bangs once, then stops. The ship lives on. Then the enemy fire tightens. The salvos start bracketing in a way that feels deliberate, like the Japanese gunners have decided to stop wasting shells on the smoke-hidden carriers and finish the destroyer that embarrassed them. Men on Johnston can tell the difference between random chaos and focused attention. This is focused. A heavy impact hits, and the ship jerks. The lights flicker in places. A voice circuit dies with a sharp hiss. Somewhere aft, a fire flares up again, bright orange against gray steel, and men rush toward it already knowing they're late. Evans gives orders that sound calm only because panic wouldn't help. Steer this way. Keep firing. Keep smoke. Keep moving. But the sea is a cruel audience. It watches you struggle and gives you nothing back. Soon the destroyer's motion becomes a crawl. The wake shrinks further. The list increases. The horizon tilts in a way that makes your legs compensate without permission. The men know what that tilt means. They've all seen it before, or heard about it, or felt it in nightmares. The point where a ship stops being a weapon and starts becoming a sinking place you still have to escape. And in the middle of that knowledge, the crew keeps doing their jobs. A gun crew stays at its mount even when they know the mount might be hit next. An engineer keeps working a valve even when the compartment is hot enough to burn skin through cloth. A radio man keeps trying to raise someone, anyone, through broken equipment because silence feels like death. The battle has moved on, but Johnston is still paying for the morning. Finally, the order comes down the ship in a tone that feels unreal because it's too simple. Prepare to abandon ship. It's not shouted like surrender. It's said like necessity. Men look at one another for half a second, just long enough for emotion to reach the surface. Then they move. Because survival is still a mission. Life jackets, rafts, lines thrown over the side. Wounded men help toward the rail with hands under arms, with gentle force that looks almost tender compared to everything that came before. The sea below is littered now. Floating debris, oil slicks, splintered wood, the occasional helmet bobbing like a dark buoy. The water looks calm until you touch it, and then it's shockingly cold, stealing breath and strength with the indifference of nature. One sailor hesitates at the rail, looking down. It's not fear of dying. Not exactly. It's the fear of leaving the ship that has been your world. Then he jumps. Others follow. Some climb down lines. Some drop. Some hit the water hard and vanish for a moment before popping back up, coughing, choking alive. Men shout names. Some answers come back. Some don't. Above them, Johnston sits lower now, wounded beyond saving. Smoke drifts from her like a final breath. Her deck is tilted. The American flag still hangs somewhere in that chaos, heavy and damp, refusing to look dramatic, just refusing to disappear. And then, in the last minutes, the destroyer that charged a battleship fleet becomes something quieter. A sinking hull under a brightening sky. Men in the water watch her go, not with cheering, not with speeches, just with a kind of stunned disbelief that a ship can fight that hard and still end like this. As Johnston slips lower, the sound of the surface battle is fading. The Japanese are farther away now. The carriers are still moving. The air is filled with distant engines and the occasional crack of gunfire. But out here, on the edge of everything, the war narrows to a circle of men in the water, faces slick with salt and oil, watching their ship disappear. And with her goes one more terrifying question. If the enemy turns back, if even one cruiser decides to finish the survivors, there's nothing left to stop it. Just open water. Just exhausted men. Just the ocean, waiting to decide who it keeps. The first thing the survivors notice, after the shock, after the coughing, after the frantic head counts shouted across drifting wreckage, is how big the ocean is when your ship is gone. It's bright now. The sun is higher. Smoke still drifts in long, bruised streaks across the horizon, but the battle itself is sliding away. Gun flashes growing smaller, then rarer, then gone. The carriers are dots behind curtains of weather. The Japanese silhouettes fade north and west like a bad dream, withdrawing into the distance. And in the middle of all that space, men float. Some on life jackets that ride too high under the chin. Some clinging to timber. Some balanced on half-inflated rafts that hiss and sag. Oil slicks spread in rainbow sheets, sticking to skin, darkening hair, turning faces into masks. Every breath tastes like salt and fuel. A sailor wipes his eyes and realizes the black on his hand isn't soot. It's oil. He looks around for Johnston, for any sign of the ship that had been their world, and sees only a disturbed patch of sea where she rolled, listed, and finally slid under. The last moments are already becoming fragments. The tilt of the deck, the order to abandon ship, the slap of water when you hit, the brief panic of sinking down before your life jacket yanked you back up. On USS Johnston, the order to abandon ship had come when the destroyer could no longer pretend she was still a fighting ship. Around 9:45, with a hull torn, system shattered, and enemy fire still searching for her. Not long after, she rolled and sank, just after 10 o'clock, around 10:10, leaving men scattered across the sea like spilled nails. In the water, time becomes a different enemy. Minutes stretch, hours warp. The sun bakes your face while the sea steals your heat from below. Your muscles cramp from the constant treading and clenching. Your throat burns with thirst, and the cruelest part is being surrounded by water you can't drink. Water that only makes you worse if you swallow it. Men call out names. Some answers come back. Some don't. A survivor shouts Evans until his voice cracks because it feels impossible that a man like Ernest E. Evans, the officer who drove them into the guns, could simply vanish. But vanish is exactly what happens sometimes at sea. Evans was seen abandoning ship, but he was never recovered, swallowed into the chaos and oil and distance, presumed lost with his ship. And then there's the detail that survivors will remember for the rest of their lives, because it feels like something from another universe. As Johnston sank, the Japanese destroyer Yukike's passed by, not firing, saluting. A line of enemy sailors, hands raised in respect, acknowledging what they had just watched. A small ship fighting beyond reason. That salute doesn't save anyone, but it changes the texture of the moment. It reminds the survivors, floating in oil-slick water, that what they did was seen. That even the enemy understood it wasn't normal bravery. It was something rarer and more terrible. Around them, other survivors from other ships bob in separate constellations. Men from Hull, whose desperate charge ended with her dead in the water and burning before she rolled under. Men from Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer Escort that fought like she didn't believe in her own size until the sea proved it did. Men from the carriers, some of them burned, some of them shaken, all of them alive only because someone else became a target first. And the ocean keeps drifting them apart. A man on a raft squints at the horizon and sees nothing, no friendly ships, no rescue wake. Only a thin line where the sky meets water. He wonders, with a sudden cold clarity, if anyone even knows exactly where they are. Because the battle didn't happen in a neat place with a neat marker on a chart. It happened inside smoke, squalls, and panic. And if you're lost out here, you can die quietly with the sun shining and nobody watching. The day passes. Then another night comes. In darkness, every splash sounds like something approaching. Every shadow on the water could be debris, or a fin, or nothing at all. Men huddle close on rafts for warmth, shoulders pressed together, teeth chattering so hard it feels like their bones are knocking. Some pray, some curse, some go silent, not because they've given up, but because they're conserving whatever they have left. The second day stretches longer than the first. Lips split, tongue swell, skin blisters, and still the carriers, those little flat tops the destroyers died for, are out there somewhere, still operating, still part of a battle that has already moved on to the next crisis. Because while these men float, commanders will be writing reports, arguing decisions, justifying choices. The war machine keeps turning, even when its parts are drifting in the sea. Finally, after what feels like a lifetime, the rescue comes. A faint shape on the horizon that grows into a ship. Then another, and another. Small wakes cutting toward clusters of survivors as lookouts point and boats are lowered. Hands reach down, real hands, warm hands, and grab wrists slick with oil. Men are hauled aboard like they weigh nothing, collapsing onto decks with the helplessness of people who have spent too long pretending they weren't afraid. Some survivors have been in the water for roughly 50 hours before they're recovered. 2 days and 2 nights of sun, salt, and exhaustion. They lie there coughing and shivering, staring up at the sky as if it's the first time they've seen it. And only then, only when the body is safe enough for the mind to start doing what it does the full shape of the miracle begin to settle in. Taffy 3 lived, not unscarred, not unbroken, but alive. And the reason is written across the morning like a bloodstain. Smoke screens, torpedo runs, frantic air attacks, and destroyers that charge battleships until there was nothing left to charge with. The survivors will learn the numbers later. The dead, the missing, the ships that didn't come home. They'll learn what Kurita did next. They'll learn that the enemy, despite having the power to crush them, turned away, confused, harassed from the air, threatened by torpedoes, and unsure what force he had truly stumbled into. But there's one more truth waiting behind all of that. A final, bitter question that will hang over Samar long after the oil slicks fade. Where was the help that was supposed to be there? Because while Taffy 3 was fighting for its life, somewhere over the horizon, the larger American fleet was chasing something else, leaving these small ships to face a battleship force alone. And when the surviving officers finally begin piecing together the radio traffic, the signals, the frantic calls, they're going to realize just how close this morning came to becoming the worst catastrophe of the entire Pacific War. The survivors don't hear the argument while they're still in the water. They don't hear it while they're shivering on rescue decks with blankets thrown over oil-slick shoulders, hands trembling so badly they can't hold a tin cup. They don't hear it while corpsmen cut away burned fabric, while medics pry salt-stiff fingers open, while someone quietly writes names on a clipboard and pauses, too often because there are too many blanks. But the argument is already happening, because the moment the guns fall silent, war does what it always does after courage has been spent. It asks coldly, why were they alone? In an operations room far away, men lean over charts and radio logs. They trace the morning like surgeons tracing a wound, San Bernardino Strait, Leyte Gulf, the Japanese center force slipping through a gap that was supposed to be guarded. They replay calls and responses, decisions and delays, and the question keeps returning, sharper each time. If a battleship fleet was coming, who was supposed to stop it? Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague had been sending calls that morning with the kind of blunt urgency you only write when you're watching death walk toward you in daylight. His carriers were small. His escorts were brave. His air groups were armed for ground support. And still, he was facing battleships. He asked for help. He begged for help. He demanded help with the only weapon he had left, his radio. Meanwhile, over the horizon, the larger American fast carrier force under Admiral William Bull Halsey was chasing what appeared to be the main Japanese carrier threat to the north, a decoy force meant to pull him away. Fast carriers, big guns, the kind of power that could have crushed a surface fleet if it had been in the right place. But it wasn't in the right place. It was elsewhere, chasing. And because it was elsewhere, Taffy 3, those 6 escort carriers and their thin screen of small boys, became the accidental cork in a bottle of disaster. When a radio traffic is finally pieced together, one message stands out. Not because it's long, but because it's the kind of sentence that carries the weight of 1,000 drowning men. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. Those words didn't come from a coward. They came from frustration sharpened into a blade. Because at Samar, people were dying while the help that should have existed on the map was somewhere else. And here's what makes it worse. The men who fought at Samar don't have the luxury of caring about blame in the moment. On the morning of October 25th, all they know is this. A battleship fleet is closing. Their carriers are running. And the only thing between them and annihilation is smoke, torpedoes, and courage. So when people later debate whether Halsey should have turned sooner, whether signals were clear enough, whether the Japanese decoy carriers were a trap that had to be taken seriously, the men of Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts are not part of that debate. They're already paid in full. The truth of Samar is that victory wasn't won by perfect planning. It was won by imperfect men doing violent, impossible things in real time. A destroyer turning toward a fleet. A destroyer escort charging a heavy cruiser. Pilots diving with half-loaded planes because they had nothing else to throw. Deck crews launching aircraft while shells walked across the sea beside them. A carrier group built for support missions surviving a surface battle against ships meant to decide wars. And in the aftermath, the numbers arrive like a second shockwave. Not just ships lost, lives. Men who never came up after the sinking. Men who floated until their bodies couldn't float anymore. Men who made it to rafts and still didn't make it home. Men who fought like they were invincible and then proved they were human. The names become part of the war's permanent vocabulary. Gamber Bay, St. Lo, Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts. And then, inevitably, the focus narrows to one ship and one man because stories need a spine. USS Johnston, the destroyer that charged first, struck hard, kept coming, and refused to let the carriers die quietly. Ernest E. Evans, the commanding officer who didn't ask whether it was survivable, only whether it was necessary. Evans doesn't come home. His ship is gone. His body is never recovered. But the legacy follows the survivors like a shadow they can't shake. Because in war, there are moments that become more than tactics. They become identity. Samar becomes one of those moments. It becomes proof that a small force can fight so violently and so intelligently that it breaks the enemy's confidence. That torpedoes and smoke and relentless harassment can bend the decisions of battleships. That courage can create confusion, and confusion can create survival. And it becomes proof of something darker, too. That the ocean doesn't care whether you were right. It only cares whether you were there. In the weeks that follow, the war rolls forward. Leyte is secured. The Philippines campaign continues. New battles rise. New names enter the casualty lists. But among those who lived through Samar, the morning stays sharp. The feel of the ship shuddering under near misses. The sight of a carrier's wake slowing as shells find her. The frantic voice on the radio calling out bearings and distances as if naming the danger can control it. The moment the enemy turn away, unbelievable, unreal, and the shock of realizing you might live. And for the men who floated for hours and days, the memory is simpler. The horizon, the thirst, the silence between rescue ships, the sense that the entire world had moved on and left them behind. Then a shape appears. Awake, a rope thrown down, hands pulling you back into a world with decks and rails and solid things. And you understand, in your bones, that you only got that rope because someone else didn't. That's the final truth of Samar. 6 escort ships didn't win by sinking every enemy vessel. They won by doing something rarer and harder. They refused to let the enemy have an easy victory. They made the cost feel uncertain. They made the situation feel bigger than it was. They made a battleship fleet turn away from prey it should have crushed. And in doing so, they bought life with their own. So when people say, the day 6 escort ships charged a battleship fleet, and somehow won, this somehow isn't a mystery. Its smoke screens laid under fire. Its torpedoes launched at the exact moment that forced a cruiser to turn. Its pilots diving with whatever they had left. Its steel hit after steel hit, and men staying at their guns anyway. It's the kind of courage that doesn't ask for permission. It just goes. Yendi,